When the great empire of the Romans fell in the west, it was the Visigoth who settled in Spain and established a kingdom. They were a race that had been nearly enslaved by the Romans, but they had risen up, grown in power, and rebelled. Along the way to their rise in power, they destroyed Roman armies, killed a Roman emperor, and in the year 410, they sacked Rome, something that hadn't been done, mind you, in 800 years. Now, unlike their predecessors, and quite apart from what later chroniclers would say, Visigoth Spain was not a beacon of sophistication. Under the Romans, the land was watered with aqueducts, crossed with roads, had cosmopolitan cities, and was the birthplace of impressive emperors. But with the coming of the, quote, Dark Ages, the economy languished into subsistence and barter, infrastructure sat neglected, and the population plummeted. The Visigoth would eventually convert to Christianity and would persecute those not of their faith. But as far as power structure was concerned, they were the only game in town. Yet, even this sense of power was deceiving. By the early 8th century, as the Islamic conquest had come to the neighboring shores of North Africa, the Visigoth were in a dynastic struggle and were essentially emerging from a civil war. It was then that a King Roderick managed to claw his way to the top of the heap, but he wasn't destined to stay at the top for very long. In April of the year 711, a Berber commander named Tariq ibn Ziyad led a force of perhaps 3,000 or 4,000 men into southern Spain. King Roderick, who was busy putting down a rebellion in the north, rushed down to engage him. The king stopped along the way to pick up some reinforcements from his countrymen, and the two armies met at the Battle of Guadalete. Now, on one side of the field, Tariq's men were disciplined and ready for a fight, and on the other side, Roderick's men were disloyal and rebellious. And when the king of the Visigoth rode into that battle, he was betrayed by his own vassals. When the dust settled from the Battle of Guadalete, the last king of the Visigoth was dead, and his army was destroyed. And with that, Visigoth Spain collapsed. Tariq ibn Ziyad and his Muslim army was soon to be heavily reinforced by his superior, the governor of Africa, a man named Musa ibn Nusayr, who basically didn't want to be left out on the spoils. And so the two men joined their forces and then led a rapid campaign of conquest. They quickly moved in and took the populated valley of the Beitis River, which they would call in Arabic Al-Wadi el-Kabir, which meant the Great River. Al-Wadi el-Kabir is where the river would later get its Spanish name, the Guadalquivir. And it was along her banks that the cities of Cordoba and Seville were located, which in time, these two cities would become the illustrious capitals of what the Arabs would call their new province, Al-Andalus. Professor Catless eloquently describes what the new conquerors thought of this land. Quote, aside from the rainy mountainous fringe along the northern Atlantic coast, its geography bore a strong resemblance to the Maghreb, Africa, Egypt, and Syria, a succession of arid plains punctuated by scrubby mountains and crossed by rivers whose waters, if harnessed, could awaken the sun-baked but fertile soil into shimmering, abundant green. Thus, to many newcomers, it would have seemed not only familiar, but idyllic, a paradise. Al-Andalus was the furthest point west that the Muslim forces had reached. In the Arab imagination, it was a distant and exotic land, fertile and overflowing with wealth. End quote. By the year 720, nearly all of the Iberian Peninsula was under the control of the Caliphate. In fact, in the eternal quest for more money, the Muslim armies would even go off into France to raid for more plunder. And it was here that they were eventually defeated at the Battle of Poitiers, or Tours, in 732 by Charles Martel, the grandfather of Charlemagne. Though in my personal humble opinion, the significance of this battle is just a little overhyped. But back in Hispania, the Muslims reigned supreme. That is, all except for a small sliver of land in the extreme north, which was protected by the Cantabrian mountain range. This last bastion, where the Christians were holding on by their fingernails, would eventually be known as the Kingdom of Asturias. The Kingdom of Asturias takes on an almost mythological presence, at least in the minds of the later Christian chroniclers. To them, she was the heir to the vaunted Visigoths, and it was here where the birth of the Reconquista was to begin. But it needs to be said that at this point in history, the Reconquista was very little to do with actual conquest and retaking of Muslim land, and much more to do with simply surviving. And this would be essentially its major goal for the next 300 years. O'Callaghan summarizes this really well. Quote, "Indeed, for most of the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries, the Christians were at the mercy of the Muslims and could only make weak and ineffectual efforts to oppose their intrusions. The chroniclers of the 10th and 11th centuries scarcely touch on the theme of reconquest, inasmuch as the Christians had all they could do to survive the overwhelming power of the Caliphate. To speak of the expulsion of the Muslims and recovery of Spain in such circumstances, one would have to have great faith in God's promises." End quote. In reality, Asturias was a backwater area, a place that even the Romans had a difficult time with. As such, there was very little infrastructure, no major roads, and few urbanized areas. Ironically enough, it was this lack of development that may have saved her from the Islamic conquest. Tariq ibn Ziyad and his countrymen, when they came through, found that the Roman roads and the rest of Hispania to be a boon to their expansion. Asturias became a rallying point for the refugees and for guerrilla fighters. You know, those who had fought for the Visigoth, and for those who would not succumb to Muslim rule. Amongst these who fled was a Visigoth nobleman. In some accounts, he was even the cousin to the fallen king Roderick. His name was Pelagius, or Peleo, and he managed to organize what was left of the fighting men of Hispania, and was credited with being the first to rise up against the Muslim horde and refuse them their annual tribute. This didn't go over very well, and the forces of Al-Andalus decided to pay him a visit in 718 or 722. Dates are not exactly precise, but the latter date appears more often. The Muslim army arrived near the city of Covadonga and demanded Pelagius' surrender, to which Don Peleo was recounted as saying, at least according to chroniclers that recorded this much later, quote, "I will not associate with the Arabs in friendship, nor will I submit to their authority, for we confide in the mercy of the Lord that from this little hill that you see the salvation of Spain, and the army of the Gothic people will be restored. Hence we spurn this multitude of pagans and do not fear them." End quote. At which point, after saying this, at least according to the same historians, Peleo rode forth and took on a Muslim army of 187,000 men, and defeated them, masterfully using the terrain of the high mountain passes. Not a bad bit of killing for one afternoon, if I can say so myself. The Battle of Covadonga would go on to mark the beginning of the Reconquest, and would become a symbol of Christian resistance to Islam, even though the magnitude of this titanic battle might have been a tad bit overhyped. Indeed, it doesn't even show up in the Muslim historical record, even though other major Islamic defeats are pretty well documented. From this point onwards, Asturias would grow and become the precursor Christian kingdom. If there's any really hardcore Tolkien fans in the audience, should become akin to the fabled island kingdom of Numenor, where all the kings of men arose. So it would come to be that for the next 50 years, she would cautiously expand along the Cantabrian mountain range and take over the northwestern portion of Hispania along the Atlantic coast. And by the year 775, under Alfonso I, Asturias would encompass the northern Duero River Valley. While this sounds promising, the land that she took was not exactly prime real estate. The valley that was north of the Duero River was sparsely populated and considered at this point in history to be an arid wasteland. It was even referred to as the Desert of the Duero, which would serve as a buffer zone or a no man's land, or for the Trekkies in the audience, it was a neutral zone. Harsh wasteland it might have been, but this wouldn't stop the Emirate of Cordoba, now unified under Abd al-Rahman I, from raiding and attacking. In fact, it really wouldn't be until the latter part of the 8th century that Asturias would really begin to coalesce. Alfonso II would firmly establish her as a kingdom, and in 789 made the city of Oviedo the capital. It was also during the time of Alfonso II that the bones of St. James or Santiago were discovered, and Santiago de Compostela would bloom into significance as a shrine and a pilgrimage route. In fact, this pilgrimage route would explode in popularity and in time would rival pilgrimages that were happening in the Holy Land. What can I tell you? They built a cathedral there and people came. And areas such as Galicia, Leon, and Castile began to get really repopulated. But this wasn't going to be the last miracle. Professor Catless gives us the riveting, if perhaps a little sarcastic, account of Asturias' rise in significance. Quote, "It was the year 844, as the story goes, and the army of Abd ar-Rahman II was arrayed on the south bank on the Ebro River at a place called Clavijo. This was in a region of northern Spain near Pamplona, which is now known as La Rioja. On the opposite bank, and much fewer in number, stood the ragtag forces of Ramiro, king of Asturias. The cruel Muslim prince, as the legend fancifully claimed, had marched north to punish the Christian king for his refusal to render the annual tribute of 100 virgin girls. Although outnumbered, Ramiro was confident his victory had been presaged in a dream. God was on his side. And as the Muslim host swept into his line, a heavenly figure appeared in the skies. A knight on a white horse who, together with a celestial army, turned the tide of battle and led Ramiro's forces to victory in the massacre of his foe. That figure was none other than St. James the Greater, who would eventually be called Matamoros, the Muslim killer, and would take on the role of patron saint in what would later be referred to as La Reconquista." End quote. Asturias now had land, a capital, a growing population, waterfront real estate, and a patron saint to top it all off. And this wasn't any ordinary saint, but St. James, Matamoros himself. This was a figure that later crusading orders would be named after. Crusading orders that would have mottos like Rubet and Sis Sanguine Arabum, may the sword run red with the blood of the Arab. Despite the ongoing raids from Al-Andalus, things were going pretty well for Asturias up until about the year 910. This was the year that the king, who was now Alfonso III, was forced by his own family at gunpoint, or I should say sword point, to abdicate the throne and divide Asturias into 3 parts. Of which, in the year 924, one of the newer states, Leon, managed to conquer the other 2 and establish the Kingdom of Leon. The Reconquista was beginning to warm up. This was the year that the king, who was now Alfonso III, was forced by his own family at gunpoint, or I should say sword point, to abdicate the throne and divide Asturias into 3 parts. Of which, in the year 924, one of the newer states, Leon, managed to conquer the other 2 and establish the Kingdom of Leon. The Reconquista was beginning to warm up. But if you read Sun Tzu, he'll tell you that the first thing you need to do is establish a justifiable cause for fighting. And again, having a super powerful militant saint like Santiago Matamoros helps this along nicely. Catless goes into the method of how the historians of that time galvanized the people and established the justification for the Reconquest. Quote, "The histories from the era of Alfonso III and those composed in the 11th century and later were written by foreign clergymen who had an explicit commitment to supporting the political supremacy of the Leonese monarchy. They happily invented histories, forged documents, concocted genealogies in order to frame the history of Spain in terms of the grand Christian-Muslim conflict. These histories conceived of the world in terms of celestial struggle. Their language was biblical and their rhetoric apocalyptic. For them, the Christians of Spain were the true Israel, a people chosen by God but cast down for their disobedience and sin, and who were now called on to reclaim their rightful place through inner piety and earthly battle against the infidel. Now, Catullus goes on to explain even more. Quote, "The narrative that they crafted, one of an eternally united Spain, defeated by foreign Muslims but then gloriously reclaimed through a process of crusade and reconquest, is no less false than the legends of Clavijo, Santiago, and Pelagius. But in its dramatic simplicity and self-affirming moralization, it has exercised an incredible appeal both in Spain and elsewhere." End quote. The history of Leon dates back to Roman times. The city was founded as a military outpost by the Roman Legio Septima Gemina. As such, she had city walls and fortifications and made a natural fort base, not to mention a good capital. She was incorporated into Asturias in 742, but as mentioned became a state of her own when Asturias was partitioned. Now it would be under her new and somewhat belligerent king, Ordoño II, that she would fight and eventually overrun her Christian neighbors, and thus unify northwestern Spain. But it wasn't going to be until 931, under Ramiro II, that Leon began to really rise to prominence. Ramiro II pushed her borders east, nearly to the Pyrenees, and took the city of Burgos and the surrounding land. This land would soon be known as the County of Castile. Much more on that in just a little bit. Ramiro was a prominent military figure, and the people of Al-Andalus would affectionately refer to him as the Devil. You see, it was under his administration that he went toe-to-toe with the Muslims of the south. In 939, the Emir, now Caliph of Cordoba, led a massive army into the north to teach the Christian kingdoms a lesson. This Caliph was none other than Abd al-Rahman III, one of the greatest rulers of Al-Andalus, and at the time was riding high on his military successes. In fact, he was so confident that he was leading his own men personally on campaign. Abd al-Rahman III had unified most of Al-Andalus at this point and had been victorious during his famous Muez campaign about 20 years earlier. It was during this campaign that he not only torched Pamplona, but also wrecked the combined forces of Leon and Navarre. He was now in the north to essentially finish the job. But Ramiro II was not one to be pushed over very easily. He set up an ambush, and the Caliph, who felt a little too secure in his supremacy, in fact, he even called his campaign omnipotence, rode right into the trap. At the Battle of Simancas in 939, the Leonese king destroyed the Muslim army and came within a hair's breadth of killing the Caliph himself. It was due to victories like this that Leon was able to expand. She now encompassed the southern portion of the Duero River Valley. Again, it was a bit of a wasteland, but whichever way you look at it, the border between Cross and Crescent was moving south, and in the process, the lands of Al-Andalus had been diminished. However, that all said, the Reconquista was then going to be put on hold for the next 100 years. Abd al-Rahman III came to power in the year 912. He inherited a land that was on the verge of collapse. After a series of, well, how else can you say it, stunning military campaigns, he restored his emirate to military power and ushered in a golden age for his economy. In 929, he declared himself Abd al-Mu'minin, which meant Commander of the Faithful. Hence, he made himself Caliph and turned his emirate into a caliphate. Al-Andalus was transformed under his leadership from a regional power to an international one, and regarded by some historians as the superpower of Western Europe. This was a time when Cordoba rivaled Constantinople and Baghdad in population and sophistication, and was regarded by the court of the Holy Roman Empire as the ornament of the world. This was a time when Abd al-Rahman III and Constantine VII of the Byzantine Empire had an unusually warm and close relationship with exchange of diplomats and knowledge. In fact, if you ever go to the Great Mosque of Cordoba, you can see Arabic inscriptions that are created using Byzantine craftsmen with imported Byzantine mosaic. This was a period where Abd al-Rahman's son, Al-Hakam II, created a library that held, it was said, 400,000 books. But this was also a time when the Caliphate of Cordoba held supremacy over the peninsula, savagely putting down rebellion when she had to, and terrified the Christian kingdoms of the north, who she raided with near impunity. When the usurper Al-Mansur took control of the Cordoban government, he only intensified the strength of the army and brought Al-Andalus to the pinnacle of her military prowess. During his reign, he led over 50 campaigns. In 985, he left Barcelona a burning pile of rubble, and in 997, he breached the sanctity of Santiago de Compostela deep within Galicia. While he was there, he demolished her cathedral and stole the sacred shrine's bells. As Professor Catless masterfully puts it in his book, the Caliphate at this point held the Christian kingdoms by the bells. But in the end, just as massively did the Caliphate rise, so did she fall. Extensive internal upheaval, persistent rebellions, and a disaffected populace brought down the mighty state in a fury. And by the year 1031, the Caliphate was abolished and replaced by a fragmented mess of competing and petty Taifa states. It was time now for the Christian kingdoms to rise to predominance once again, and in the northeastern part of the peninsula, a small Christian enclave would seek her destiny. The people of the Basque region on the western end of the Pyrenees are one of the most ancient in Europe. Their ancestry is over 7,000 years old, and some claim that they were there even before agriculture became the norm. In fact, their native language is unique in Europe. And while they've been subjugated by others, they've maintained a strong and proud sense of identity, and rightfully so. Prior to the Islamic conquest, the Basque region was within the sphere of influence of the Franks, and it wasn't until 718 that they were overrun by the Muslim forces of Al-Andalus. They became a vassal, but in time they established some degree of autonomy. When Charlemagne came through in 778, he attacked them and destroyed the city walls of their capital, Pamplona. But the Basque, who were fierce, fought back. They annihilated Charlemagne's rear guard at the pass of Roncesvalles and killed the famous knight Roland, inflicting, some say, Charlemagne's only major defeat. Now, for the next 50 years, the land would alternate back and forth between the interests of the Franks and the Muslims of the Emirate of Cordoba. However, that sense of Basque autonomy would only grow and eventually lead to rebellion. In 824, a Frankish army was sent to subdue the rebellious Basque and made it as far as the gates of Pamplona. But as they were making their way back, the Basque once again attacked them in the very same pass of Roncesvalles. The second battle of Roncesvalles went exactly like the first, but this time the Basque also had Muslim allies. The Frankish army was destroyed, and its generals were sent back to Cordoba as a present. And as such, the Basque chieftain who led the attack, Íñigo Arista, was elected as the king of Pamplona, and has since been recognized as the founder of the Kingdom of Pamplona. Now, the kingdom would need time to grow and would find itself being attacked and attacking all of her neighbors, both Christian and Muslim alike. However, her true fortune was intimately tied to the success of the Cordoban Emirate. Now, to give you an example, when the emirate was weak, Pamplona would be expanding. In 907, the ruler, Sancho I, who 2 years earlier had declared himself king, sent his armies out and took the county of Aragon. But when the emirate was strong, that is, when Abd al-Rahman III came to power and made the emirate into a caliphate, Pamplona would be on the receiving end of pain. It was during Abd al-Rahman's Muez campaign that Basque land would be devastated. And as mentioned before, the city of Pamplona was sacked in 924. But this was just for starters. When Almansor took power, the raids into the northeast would only intensify. It became almost like a hobby for the Caliphate to sucker punch the kingdom over and over and over again. Now that said, one of the reasons that the Kingdom of Pamplona would in part survive was due to her astute use of political marriages. By the end of the 10th century, her royalty would be related to nearly all the major powers, including blood ties with the Caliphate itself. After all, Abd al-Rahman III's paternal grandmother was Oñeca Fortuñez, who was the daughter of the King of Pamplona. Now, I don't know about you, but a family reunion in this type of political environment I think would have been a very interesting affair. The Kingdom of Pamplona would eventually get her chance. If you recall, in the early 11th century, the Great Caliphate fell and fractured into the smaller Taifa states, which they promptly began to fight and kill one another, and this was the perfect opportunity. It was then that the Kingdom of Pamplona would once again be able to assert her authority. Sancho III, or as he'd be known as Sancho the Great, inherited the Kingdom of Pamplona in 1004, just as the Caliphate of Cordoba was about to be consumed, in some cases literally, by fire and internal revolt. The man was both a shrewd politician and a skilled military leader, and from what I've read, was quite dashing with the ladies. The ambitious policy of expansion that he would adopt would require him to use all of these abilities. To expand his eastern border, he would seize lands from the Franks north of the Pyrenees. And then south of the Pyrenees, his army would conquer large portions of the county of Aragon. On his western border, he astutely married the daughter of the Count of Castile, and under the pretense of being its protector, he became the de facto ruler of this county. And then, in 1034, after defeating a string of rivals, and it should be noted that most of them were Christian, he captured the city of Leon. By the time of his death, the very next year, in 1035, the Kingdom of Pamplona extended from the city of Leon to the Pyrenees and onward to the borders of Catalonia, which is the easternmost portion of Spain. But from this point onwards, it would be a period of decline. Sancho III's lands would be divided, and over the next 200 years, the Kingdom of Pamplona, soon to be known as the Kingdom of Navarre, would be picked at by a host of aggressive neighbors. However, despite being reduced in size, her core would remain strong. Just ask anybody of Basque descent today. And remember this. Later, when the powerful Caliphate of North Africa, the Almohad, invaded, it was at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212, which turned the tide against the Almohad, that it would be a king of Navarre, Sancho VII, or Sancho el Fuerte, the Strong, that would find, exploit, and breach the lines of the Muslim army and nearly execute the caliph. But this is still in the future of our narrative, and as just mentioned, in the aftermath of Sancho III, his lands were divided. But this division would give rise to two of the most powerful kingdoms of the Reconquista, Aragon and Castile. Now, like I've mentioned before, in the first 300 years, roughly 711 to 1031, the nature of the Reconquista was more about survival. And towards the end of this time, it eventually became more about consolidation of the Christian kingdoms, not so much about reconquering the south. But you gotta keep in mind that up until 1031, when the Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba was officially abolished, the Christian kingdoms were still pretty much at the mercy of the Muslims in the south. The flow of tribute would come from the north and make its way directly into the treasury of the Caliph. But when this mighty state fell, the situation was turned completely on its head. Catless again puts this really well. Quote, "The political environment of post-Caliphal Al-Andalus was ruthlessly pragmatic, reflexively opportunistic, and highly atomized. Among the clans, families, and individuals that struggled to hold power, none had a coherent ideological or religious platform, and their internal politics were characterized by regular usurpations, betrayals, revolts, and intrafamilial violence." End quote. Well, this is Game of Thrones on steroids. It was like playing a game of Risk, except with 50 players. People would wake up one day and note that 3 taifa states were wiped out in the night. In time, the bigger fish swallowed the smaller ones, and the taifas of the great cities like Seville, Zaragoza, Badajoz, Toledo, Granada became the big kids on the block. But this was all relative. The Christian kingdoms, in comparison now, were just as big, if not bigger. And this would seem like the perfect opportunity for reconquest, no? Not quite. O'Callaghan sums it up nicely. Quote, "The Christian states of Leon, Castile, Navarre, Aragon, and Catalonia, however, were as much rivals of one another as the kings of the taifas. Rather than present a united front in opposition to Islam, Christian rulers vied with one another in imposing tribute on the taifas and later contended over rights of conquest. When it suited their purpose, Christian princes did not hesitate to make alliances with Muslims. From time to time, individual knights, including the Cid, who was often hailed as the great hero of the Christian reconquest, entered the service of Muslim rulers and fought against their fellow Christians." End quote. The Reconquista was still not quite the united front that later chroniclers would have you believe, but it was changing. The Christian kingdoms of the north seemed for the most part more content in just reaping in the tribute called parias rather than reconquering the south. And why would they? I mean, why would you want to attack your cash cow? This was basically a new normal that was being established, where you had ruthless kings who were willing to play really dirty in order to succeed, and not just against the taifas, but also against their fellow Christians. The playing field had, after all, changed, and the rules for playing the game had only gotten more brutal. The mentality of the Reconquista and the Christian kings had firmly gone from survival to full exploitation. Between Leon in the west and Navarre in the east was the small county of Castile, which during the late 10th century was slowly gaining a sense of sovereignty. She had been a part of Leon, which by the early 11th century was in a bit of decline, and then through marriage became a part of Navarre. But in the year 1035, when the king of Navarre, Sancho III, died, he divided up his lands amongst his sons and gave control of Castile to his youngest son, Ferdinand. Ferdinand was only in his teens when he became the Count of Castile, and being one of the youngest sons, was soon an open target by all of his siblings. For those of you in the audience who are the youngest member of a large family, you'll probably know what this must have felt like. Now remember when I said this generation of rulers had to play really dirty? Ferdinand was really good at it. In 1037, over a land dispute, he fought his brother-in-law, Bermudo III, who was the king of Leon. At the Battle of Tamarón, it was said that Bermudo fell from his horse and Ferdinand's men pounced on him. Now, if you thought Julius Caesar's death was brutal, a 20th century autopsy showed that Bermudo had approximately 40, that's 40, lance wounds to the abdomen. I guess Ferdinand really wanted to make sure the guy was dead. At which point, he claimed Leon as his own property and proclaimed himself king. Over a decade later, he turned his attention east and defeated his brother, who was the king of Navarre, and took a big chunk out of his land and reduced Navarre to a vassal. He even went so far as to fight Aragon as well. Now, with his power base secured and growing, major Taifa states like Toledo began to pay him tribute. Now, those Taifa states that didn't pay him tribute, well, they became a target for the fury of his armies, which he was not shy to unleash. In 1055, he attacked deep into what would one day be Portugal, taking the city of Coimbra after a long siege. He also brought the fight to other Taifas like Seville, Badajoz, and Valencia. Ferdinand I of Leon, as he'd be known, was nearly unstoppable. Indeed, in 1056 he was given the title Emperor. This man gave new life to the Reconquista and was remembered by Muslim chroniclers as saying, quote, "We demand our land, which a long time ago you conquered, and which you have inhabited for as long as been ordained by God. Now he has given us victory over you on account of your wickedness. Depart to your own shores of North Africa and give our land up to us. For there is no good in your living with us any longer, nor will we turn away from you until God has judged between you and us." End quote. Ferdinand I of Leon clearly had an army, plus he had the motivation. And what's more, he had nearly united all of the Christian kingdoms. So what could possibly go wrong? Right. He died in 1065 and divided his vast kingdom to his 3 sons, who immediately began to fight and try to kill one another. Ferdinand's land was divided into 3 kingdoms. Going from east to west, you had Castile, Leon, and Galicia. Now his oldest child, named Sancho II, got Castile. His middle child, who was also his favorite, named Alfonso VI, got Leon. And his youngest son, named Garcia II, got Galicia. To make a long story short, the 2 older brothers ganged up on the youngest and took his land. And then, after a brief respite, the oldest brother, again Sancho II, also seized the middle one's land. I guess the guy was just on a roll. Sancho II, after unifying the 3 kingdoms, decided, I guess for his own amusement, to subject the middle brother to a series of humiliations. He had him first imprisoned, then he had him confined in a monastery, he made the monks shave his head, and then to top it all off, he exiled him to the Muslim Taifa state of Toledo. In retrospect, I think Sancho II probably should have just had his brother killed right then and there. The man who was exiled to Toledo, again the middle child, who was named Alfonso VI, would not stay in exile for more than just a couple of months. Later, in the very same year that he was exiled, 1072, the older brother who had stolen his land, again Sancho II, was assassinated under somewhat suspicious terms while laying siege to the city of Zamora. Naturally, all eyes turned to Alfonso VI, who had to strenuously deny any involvement in the murder. He even went so far as to lay his hand on the Bible and, in a somewhat dramatic scene, publicly declare that he was innocent. Yeah, right. Alfonso VI immediately returned to the north to reclaim the crowns of the 3 kingdoms, which over the next decade he consolidated, brutally in some cases, into a powerful state that would be called the Kingdom of Leon Castile. In his rise to power, he even managed to strong-arm the Kingdom of Navarre into giving him territory and paying him tribute. he was beginning to feel so confident in his position that he even took the title Imperator Totius Hispania, Emperor of all of Hispania. The growing power of Castile-Leon made the Muslim Taifa states extremely nervous. And in the shadow of this rising state, the parillas, the tribute, began to just flood in. Now, strangely enough, while Alfonso VI was getting ever more powerful and not to mention insanely rich, the Taifas began to fight amongst themselves even more. Again, this would have been a great opportunity for reconquest, but the allure of milking the Taifas for money was just too much to turn away, and it would seem that this would be the status quo for quite some time. However, it would be in the year 1085 that everything would change. The ruler of Toledo, due to massive internal unrest, couldn't hold on to power, and made a deal with Alfonso to basically give him the city if the king of Castile-Leon could grant him safe passage to another Taifa. It was a deal that Alfonso VI couldn't pass up, and so after a mock siege, on May 25th in the year 1085, Toledo was returned to Christian rule forever. This was a critical turning point. The Reconquista had now made its way from the Duero River Valley down to the Tagus, and the Taifa states were really freaking out. They realized that even the biggest amongst them was not invulnerable to the power of the Christian kingdoms. Something needed to be done to turn the tide. And the Taifa's response would be the equivalent of the medieval nuclear option. In a state of extreme desperation, some of the remaining Taifa states invited in the Almoravids from North Africa. The Almoravids were a vast group of Berbers that had been brought together by the leadership of the tribes of the Sanhaja. They were united under their strict interpretation of Islam. But strict religious orthodoxy aside, these fierce, veiled warriors from the Maghreb owed their military power and ruggedness to the harshness of the Sahara, which they once called home, and they were going to take the Iberian Peninsula by storm. In 1086, the year after Toledo fell, an Almoravid army arrived in Al-Andalus and began to march north. Alfonso VI disengaged from a siege of the city of Zaragoza and headed south to stop him. The ensuing confrontation was going to be a vicious one, known as the Battle of Sagrajas. In Arabic, it was known as Al-Zalaqa, which meant slippery ground, as the bloodshed was so great that the soldiers would literally slip on it as they fought. The Almoravids would win this fight and deal Alfonso VI just a massive defeat. But their momentum was still very strong, and they would win again in 1097 at the Battle of Consuegra, and again in 1108 at the Battle of Euclis, where Alfonso VI's only son and male heir would be killed. They would even bring down the mighty king of Aragon, Alfonso the Battler, at the siege of Fraga in 1134, where a lucky Almoravid archer shot him through the eye. In due time, the Almoravids managed to annex pretty much all of Al-Andalus into their domain, which also included a vast swathe in North Africa. And in so doing, they threw the War of Reconquest back a bit. But, lucky for the Christians, they never fully exploited their victories, and they never led a full-blown war to subjugate the north. But even as the Almoravids were stopping the Reconquista in its tracks, a new nation would be emerging. early land that would one day become Portugal was once a portion of the Roman province of Lusitania and Galicia. It was during the time of the Early Reconquest that she became a portion of the Kingdom of Asturias. Specifically, she became a county when the city of Porto was retaken by Vimara Perez in 868. This man was a vassal to the King of Asturias, who would later make him the first Count of Portugal. Later, after Asturias fell, she became a portion of the Kingdom of Leon, but gained a greater sense of autonomy when Leon had poor leadership. However, the story of the birth of Portugal as its own kingdom was about as close to a telenovela as one can get. And telenovela, by the way, for those who are not familiar, is Spanish for soap opera. Now, going back for a second, as I just mentioned, the Almoravids had just arrived and had dealt Alfonso VI a massive defeat at the Battle of Sagrajas in 1086. Alfonso VI was in a really bad position. His army was destroyed, and he was kind of desperate, and so he called on the knights of Western Europe for help. A handful of lords came, including Raymond of Burgundy and his cousin Henry. These two men distinguished themselves in the fight against the Almoravids, so much so that Alfonso gave them his daughters in marriage. Now, of the two men, Raymond seemed to come out on top. He married a legitimate daughter and was given the governorship of Galicia in the northwest. But by the time it got to Henry, Alfonso was running out of daughters, and so he arranged for him to be married to Teresa of Leon, his illegitimate daughter by his mistress Jimena Muñoz. But don't feel so bad for him. In the end, he lucked out. Teresa of Leon proved to be a formidable woman and an excellent partner. As it would eventually turn out, Raymond and Henry really liked Leon Castile. In fact, they got together and concocted a plan to divide up Alfonso's land and steal the treasury. However, Alfonso VI got wind of the attempted coup. Now, he could have had them killed, but instead Alfonso raised his pinky to the side of his lip and masterfully decided to make Henry the governor of the county of Portugal, effectively making him Raymond's neighbor, and as expected, the two cousins, now with a shared border but with conflicting interests, began to quarrel. And of course, any plot to overthrow the government went simply out the window. Henry of Burgundy and his new wife, Teresa, became very protective of their new turf, and as the Almoravids provided a decent distraction for the rest of the Christian kingdoms, they declared Portugal a separate entity from Galicia in 1095, even though technically she was still under the jurisdiction of Castile-Leon. When Henry died in the year 1112, his son, Afonso Henriques, came to power. But here's the thing, Henry's wife, Teresa of Leon, now Teresa of Portugal, was not quite ready to relinquish command. She and her new lover raised their own personal army to maintain control. But when these two lost favor in the court of Castile, Afonso Henriques finally had the green light to act. Afonso had to struggle, but eventually he raised his own army and then had to fight his own mother and her lover, who was Count Fernando Perez de Trava of Galicia. At the Battle of São Mehmed on June 24th in the year 1124, Afonso came out victorious and was proclaimed Prince of Portugal. He would go on from there to distinguish himself again and again in battle, but this time he was fighting against the Almoravids. At the Battle of Orique in 1139, he stopped the Muslims in their tracks, despite being outnumbered. After this confrontation, he was proclaimed King of Portugal. Now, king he might have been declared, but the forces of Leon, who were now under the control of Alfonso VII, arrived on his doorstep in 1141 to put him in his place. Afonso I rode out to engage the forces of Leon at the Battle of Valdevez. The fight became more or less a jousting tournament, as the Almoravids were still powerful, and the two Christian kingdoms realized, wisely, that they needed to conserve their respective manpower. But when that day ended, Afonso I had won the tournament. And 2 years later, with the Treaty of Zamora, Portugal had won her independence. But Afonso I wasn't done yet. Now, it just so happened that a few years later, in 1147, that the Second Crusade broke out. Now, knights from all over Western Europe were making their way to the Holy Land, including a contingent that just happened to stop off at the city of Porto at the mouth of the Duero River. Afonso I just happened to be around, and so the King of Portugal decided to convince the Crusaders to take a break from their holy religious duties and instead join him in taking the city of Lisbon. Afonso sweetened the deal and presented them with the prospect of plunder, and so they readily agreed to fight for him. And thus, in October of 1147, after a siege, Lisbon became a part of Portugal, and approximately 100 years later would become the capital. Now, along with the fall of Toledo, this was another great Taifa state that had fallen. The capture of Lisbon would be a major milestone in the Reconquista, and from then on, there was going to be no disputing that Portugal was a sovereign realm. In fact, she would be recognized by the Pope in 1179. And despite the attempts of Leon and later the Almohads to recapture her territory, she would hold firm. Portugal would even go on under her next king, Alfonso II, to contribute her forces to help at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa. And even after this battle, she would continue her contribution to the Reconquista by advancing further south into Al-Andalus and taking the lands known as the Algarve. By the year 1249, she had just about established her modern borders. Afonso I would be known to history by many names. Afonso Henriques, Alfonso the Great, Afonso the Conqueror, but perhaps his best title was Afonso the Founder. Portugal came into being with a baptism of fire, first from the aggression of Leon, and then in the shadow of the Almoravids, and in time under the assault of the Almohad. She was going to prove herself capable of the challenge, but she was not the only one. On the other end of the peninsula, the last great Christian kingdom was about to join the Reconquista as well. Aragon and the nearby counties of Catalonia, which it would join through marriage, would develop into some of the most passionately proud lands of medieval Spain, and some of those traits are still alive and well today. Much like Castile, Aragon got a relatively late start in the game, but would go on to become a major player. As mentioned before, when Sancho III of the Kingdom of Pamplona, later to be known as the Kingdom of Navarre, died in 1035, he divided his lands into 3 parts. Now, of the 3 parts, the western portion became Castile, the central portion remained Navarre, but the easternmost section would give rise to the Kingdom of Aragon. This latter portion would be given to his illegitimate son, Ramiro I, who had to fight extensively to establish the independence of his new territory. His expansion and that of his son would see the small kingdom of Aragon grow from a small estate nestled in the foothills of the Pyrenees to encompass a much larger area, and this at the expense of both his Christian and his Muslim neighbors. Eventually, as a consequence of his expansion, in 1096 the new capital of the Kingdom of Aragon was established in the city of Huesca, which had just been recently captured. But it was Ramiro's grandson, who would also be the son-in-law of Alfonso VI, more on that in just a little bit, who really got things rolling. This man was known as Alfonso I of Aragon, and was given the title El Bateador, or the Battler. And trust me, he earned this title. Ironically enough, for a man who would later be known for his military prowess, Alfonso I of Aragon began his early life in a monastery. It would be here that he would learn the art of reading, writing, and of course there'd be a very heavy emphasis on medieval warfare, which granted was pretty standard stuff for the time. This was, after all, in the wake of the Crusading era, when crusading orders like that of the Templars and the Hospitallers were becoming very powerful. Indeed, Spain had her own crusading orders. Now, it wouldn't be very long until Alfonso started to join his siblings on military campaigns, most of which were directed against the Almoravids of North Africa. Aragon was as much on the front line as anyone could possibly be, so there was always ample chance to extend his education further. When it was all said and done, the man would have a major in medieval warfare against the Moor, with a minor in crusading ideology. It was even said that he joined the legendary El Cid on expedition to take Valencia in 1094. So no matter which way you look at it, his upbringing gave him a taste for battle that never seemed to have left him. Now, in the grand scheme of things, fortune began to smile on him. Deaths in the family put the young Alfonso I in line to assume the throne, which he did in the year 1104. He was pretty young at the time, and other Christian kingdoms saw this as an opportunity. Shortly after Alfonso I assumed the throne, the King of Castile-Leon, again sensing an opportunity, the man basically wanted to extend the rule of his family, and so offered his daughter, Urraca of Leon, to Alfonso. And in due course of time, the two were married, which was lovely, at least at the time. But Urraca had absolutely no intention of handing over even an iota of power to her new husband, and so the two began to quarrel intensely. And quarrel probably doesn't even come close to giving this justice. I mean, I don't think any amount of marriage counseling would have helped here. The personal fight between these two got so bad that it spilled out into open warfare between Aragon and Castile. At one point, Alfonso had to lay siege to the city of Astorga, where his wife, Urraca, was essentially trapped inside. Now, if laying siege on your wife isn't enough to settle your disputes and solve your marital woes, Alfonso would go on to defeat her army in battle twice. The two people, like the two kingdoms, figuring out that they could not kill or subjugate the other, decided finally just to part ways and do their own thing, which was just fine for Alfonso. The man had another agenda. Alfonso I, known as El Bateador, would now resume control over his domain. He quickly turned his attention to fighting the Almoravids, and over the next several years he attacked them throughout the entire Ebro River Valley, slowly pushing them back and taking a half-dozen cities in the process. But his crowning achievement was getting the Pope to sanction his own personal crusade, and then leading it onwards to take the city of Zaragoza, which he managed to do in 1118. This was one of those milestones of the Reconquista, where one of the major taifas had fallen into Christian hands, but Alfonso was just getting warmed up. Over the course of the next 10 years, he would destroy an Almoravid army at the Battle of Cutanda. He went on to seize pretty much the entire Ebro River Valley and then captured another dozen cities. He did so well that the king of Castile Leon even made a treaty with him, dividing up Al-Andalus into separate spheres of conquest. These two kings were so confident that they had basically divided up the pie that was Al-Andalus and assigned each an area to conquer so that their armies wouldn't, God forbid, clash with one another. Which is kinda thoughtful. As far as bloody invasions go, anything less, I guess, would be uncivilized. But this plan was not to work out. Alfonso died like he lived, in battle. During the siege of the city of Fraga, he was shot through the eye by a Muslim archer and died shortly thereafter. His death in 1134 led to a succession crisis, as he had no heir and had bequeathed in his will most of his lands and money to the crusading orders. Which, if you think about it, for a medieval king, this is noble and generous. I mean, what a great last wish of a dying man, no? Well, this was promptly ignored by the aristocracy of Aragon, and his brother came to power instead. Now, once he had taken power, he decided to solidify Aragon's strength through marriage. It was decided at this point that the Princess of Aragon, who was Alfonso's niece, a woman named Petronilla, would marry Raymond, the Count of Barcelona. And thus, in 1137, the Kingdom of Aragon and the County of Catalonia were merged together, at least in marriage, into what would be called the Crown of Aragon, which was not officially sanctioned until the son of Raymond and Petronilla came to power in 1162. The Christian kingdom seemed like they were making advances in all fronts. Indeed, the mid-12th century, from 1130 to 1150, it would appear that the Reconquista was in the fast track of having complete victory. Part of this had to do with the fact that the nature of the Reconquista had changed once again. The Christian kingdoms had gone from survival to consolidation to exploitation to full-blown war and then reconquest. But along the way, it had been infused with the zeal of religious holy war ideology. Now we need to go back a second to the year 1064. This was the year that Pope Alexander II declared remission of sins for any Western knight willing to cross the Pyrenees and free the city of Barbastro. Remission of sins by the Pope was huge, and the call to action was quickly accepted. Barbastro, after a few months of siege, was taken. But then the next year it was retaken by the Muslims, but for the time being, just table that fact. This was one of the first times that the idea of a papal-sanctioned religious war was recorded. And just to emphasize the point, it happened 30 years before the First Crusade. But you got to admit, the precedence was set. And subsequently, when the Crusades actually did break out, well then everybody wanted to be a part of it. It suddenly became the new normal for Christians, and not just those of Iberia, to band together for the common goal of fighting the infidel. And what's more, nearly the same thing was happening on the Muslim side. Chris Lowney, in his book, A Vanished World, gives us all a dose of reality. And I'm paraphrasing a little here. Quote, "Instead of moving forward, Spain seemed to be stuck on a treadmill of hatred and violence. With Toledo's capture, that treadmill only began to spin at a faster pace. It was now that Muslim revivalist Almoravids faced off against Crusader knights. Both sides were ratcheting up the religious rhetoric to accompany the more hostile tempo of their encounters." Lowney continues, quote, "The momentum was slowly, tentatively, yet inexplicably shifting to the Christian side, but the balance of power remained uncertain. And yet, the violent religious rhetoric only intensified as both sides called on co-religionists to nothing less than holy war." End quote. The kings of Hispania were going to milk crusading ideology when it suited them, and for the Reconquista, this was going to be a great time. Think about the advances that were made. Aragon took Zaragoza in 1118 via crusade, and then later consolidated with Catalonia into a powerful state. The Portuguese in 1147 took Lisbon with the help of crusaders. And during the same time, Castile-Leon, under her new king, Alfonso VII, would put his kingdom on the offensive and would raid deep into Al-Andalus. He would raze and pillage the lands as far south as Cordoba. Eventually, he made it all the way south and took the coastal city of Almeria in 1147. And this was done again with the help of other Christians, this time as far away as Genoa. And to help things along, the Almoravids, who took the peninsula by storm and seemed initially unstoppable, were now under attack from seemingly everywhere, including a new massive uprising in their homeland of Morocco, which would eventually wipe them out. As I had just mentioned, this was a great time for the Reconquista, but it's usually when everything seems like it's going well and perfectly lined up. That's when the rug gets pulled out from beneath you. The Almoravids of North Africa were brought down by the Almohad, who took their capital of Marrakesh in 1146. The Almohads were a new political entity in the Maghreb. They had established a caliphate in what is now Morocco, which had an even stricter view on Islam. They felt it was their religious duty to bring down anybody who didn't share in their orthodoxy, and to them it didn't matter if you were Christian or Muslim. Whereas the Almoravid took Hispania by storm, the Almohad would take it by hurricane. After conquering nearly all of northwestern Africa, they brought their massive armies across the Strait of Gibraltar, and they arrived at just the right time. The Christian kingdoms, who had enjoyed a period of winning over Al-Andalus, were now in a completely different position. In the latter part of the 12th century, they were going through a new generation of, let's just call it, very ineffectual leadership. Ironically enough, it was the Taifa states that would initially be putting up the most amount of resistance against the Almohad. But the armies of the Almohad, with their seemingly inexhaustible manpower, gradually subjugated all of the Taifa states. By approximately 1172, Al-Andalus was firmly under their control, at which point they turned their attention to the north and launched a series of attacks against the Christian kingdoms. Portugal would be pushed back. Aragon and Castile, which had been at one point confident enough to set up areas of conquest, were stopped in their tracks. And with the death of the rather militant Alfonso VII in 1157, Leon and Castile would be once again divided, and just like the last time, within a blink of an eye, the two respective kingdoms of Leon and Castile would be at each other's throats. And then, of course, things went from bad to worse. In July of 1195, the Almohads met up with the Castilian army, now under their new king, Alfonso VIII, at the Battle of Alarcos. This would turn out to be a horrendous fight. But in the end, the Almohad crushed the Castilians. And in the aftermath of this disaster, the Christian kingdoms would turn against one another violently. In fact, the King of Leon, Alfonso IX, even made an alliance with the Almohad to attack his fellow Christians. So ask yourself, just how bad did things get at this point? Well, let's take a look at the response to Alfonso IX's attack on his fellow Christians. O'Callaghan relates the story. Quote, Sancho I of Portugal appealed to the Pope for crusading indulgences, not against the Almohad, but against Alfonso IX, to which in response, Celestine III on April 10th in the year 1197 conceded to those who attacked the King of Leon the same remission of sins that were given to crusaders. End quote. This was absolutely nuts. Not only did you have the Christian kingdoms attacking one another, but you also had them declaring holy war on each other, crusading against fellow Christians. And keep in mind that this was all happening while a powerful Muslim force was just watching on. The only thing that really saved the Christian kingdoms was the fact that the Almohad didn't exploit their victories. But there were a lot of reasons why this happened. The Almohad never had a good logistical system. They never had really good siege equipment. And then there was the fact that they were a vast empire and were putting down rebellions and uprisings on pretty much every other front. Now, it also seemed that they just lacked the motivation to decide, hey, you know what? We're going to get it together and we're going to conquer the rest of the Iberian Peninsula. But that mentality changed in the year 1211. That was the year they decided to get serious about invading. The Almohads had unwisely given the Christian kingdoms a chance to rebuild. And as soon as Castile and Aragon even had a chance, they promptly began to raid Al-Andalus all over again. Thus, the Almohad had to finally get serious about them. And I guess their mentality was that they had toyed with these non-believers long enough, and it was time to teach them a stern lesson in discipline. Perhaps even to end them once and for all. In particular, Alfonso VIII of Castile and Pedro II of Aragon were especially large thorns in their sides and would be the focus of their fury. A massive Muslim army was raised and sent across into the Iberian Peninsula, where they managed to take a few castles. This was done with the intent of continuing the campaign to conquer Castile the next year. Alfonso VIII knew he couldn't win alone, but at the same time, he knew where he could get additional powerful soldiers who knew how to fight. That is, he knew the fighting spirit of his fellow Christian kingdoms. I mean, after all, he had fought nearly all of them. He gambled on the idea that he could unite them together, and therefore he asked the Pope, who was now Innocent III, for help. Alfonso VIII got really lucky. A new crusade was proclaimed, and the Knights of Western Europe answered the call. But they were not going to be alone. The Portuguese, who had fought long and hard for their independence, arrived. The fighting men of Aragon and their Catalonian allies, who were just as skilled at warfare, came. The soldiers of Navarre, who had proudly defended their unique Basque homeland, showed up. And even though the King of Leon, Alfonso IX, refused, the Knights of Leon came anyway. They were then joined by the crusading orders of the Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Orders of Santiago, to name a few. Just south of the pass of Despeñaperros in central Spain, the two armies met in July of the year 1212. And when the dust settled from what would be known as the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, it was the combined Christian armies, united under the banner of crusade, that had won the day. The Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa was a fight that the Almohad were never able to fully recover from, at least not in Al-Andalus. They would be turned back, and within a few decades their vast empire would fall. Unfortunately, the Christian kingdoms were not in a position where they could really exploit their victory. The Reconquista began with a resolution to simply avoid annihilation. And with starts and stops in multiple side quests and distractions and conflicting alliances and crusading rhetoric, it grew into a position of authority. Along the way, it would captivate the minds of Europe. Al-Andalus at one point held supremacy during the time of the Caliphate of Cordoba, and was quote-unquote saved by first the Almoravids and then later the Almohad. But now, as the Almohad retreated, she reverted back to her fractured, weak Taifa states, and this time, there was no one left to come to her rescue. In contrast, after Las Navas de Tolosa, a new generation of Christian kings would come to power. They would prove to be even more ferocious than the last batch, and they would unleash an assault that would bring an all-new meaning to the term Reconquista. To them, there was no longer any question of failure. The defeat of Al-Andalus was no longer an if, but rather a when. The only question that really mattered was who was going to be the biggest and most powerful when Islamic Spain fell. But that, dear listener, is a story for another time.